Hello, everybody. It's very, very nice to be here.
Number nine.
That's my little test audio sound file, so I know that the audio is working. Excuse me. Thank you so much for having me. It's been super interesting this morning to hear the talks. I'm going to talk about some related themes that I just heard Elena go through in really amazing detail. I'll talk a little bit about me and my work and how that relates to the mission that I have in a bigger sense. So I work in commercials as an immersive director. A lot of VR and AR stuff, but also traditional TV commercials, for example. I have been working quite a bit lately in the volumetric space, and I'll explain a little bit more about that and show you that project. And I have an R&D studio that is focusing much more on some of these bigger questions that are related to the theme of choose your own reality and how all of us are beginning to be able to edit the spaces that we are in and make them custom to us or valuable to us. But equally, those spaces could be misleading to us. So yeah, I'm an immersive director. I work for hire. People hire me for my work, for my skills or talents, and often mostly for the teams that I work with on a regular basis, the people that I take with me. One of the key things that I often am asked, and one of the key questions that I think the industry should always ask itself, is why we're doing VR or AR. And I heard Noni de la Peña recently mention, not exactly in this way, but similarly, the answer, which was incredible to me. When you watch it, it's them, and when you experience it, it's you. It's a really powerful statement, I think, that justifies sometimes what immersive technologies can do for us. Many of the stories that I work with and that I innovate around allow you to step into a world or into a life that is not your own and to experience something different and change your mind. But it has to be about you for it to have the same kind of impact. And if it is about somebody else's life, which is ultimately the case, the impact can be the same, but the experience is different. I'm very interested in virtual memories and persistent virtual presence. So in other words, what are all of these experiences that we have in virtual and augmented reality? What do they combine as? How do they remain here? And is there a virtual experience that it became a memory in my mind and changes the way that I interact with the real world? How the real and the virtual are merging in that way, both in terms of memory and how this allows us to change or to edit our reality or to choose it, I'll talk about in a second. But one of the key, or the two key themes within which that kind of works for me in my work is, firstly, it changes your perception and your identity. It changes what you are and what you see and what you think. And secondly, it changes where you are and where you're able to go and how easily you're able to be in multiple places at once. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the projects I've gone through over the last few years. I work quite a lot in the VR journalism space, experiences that really focus on factual layers and factual stories. Firstly, there is The Party. Now, The Party is a project, let me check if this works. Yeah, great. So, The Party is a project about autism. I built this project at The Guardian with a big in-house team. It was initially a project started by Lucy Hawking, and then we built a research team at Cambridge University. And it's really about representing autism as an experience. In other words, we spent about 20 hours talking to different people that are autistic, understanding what their daily life is like, and then we created a scenario that allows you to experience that. It's important to point out that this isn't a project that I wrote or created. I was part of a really important team of people that have first-hand experience with what autism is like on a daily basis, including Lucy Hawking, who was the beginning, and Sumita here, who was the scriptwriter on our project, as an example, and then the research team at Cambridge, and of course, the team over at The Guardian, Francesca and Shahani, were all a super important part of this project coming to life. So this project is told from a neurodiverse perspective. Really, this is not so much me telling you what it is like. It is the autistic community that we talk to and spend time with telling us what it's like, and then me using my skills to bring that to life. A really quick glimpse for you.
I don't think you'd have known I was autistic. So you put me in a birthday party setting.
When I'm anxious, my brain flashes things at me.
It seems to build up and up and up. It's kind of like when you're in a tube stop, and you know when the tube goes past really quickly.
So the basic premise of the experience is you are at a birthday party. And it isn't your birthday party, it's your sister's. And this creates a whole range of different scenarios in which both people who are very close to you, your parents or your family, but also people who might not be so close to you, your neighbors or friends or family, interact with you and speak with you. The experience is told from the camera's point of view, it's first-person POV. That means you are the camera and you see the world around you happening. And there are two layers of the narrative. This is really key, because this is also what brings on a sensory overload, a panic attack in essence, for autistic people. There's an inner narrative, there's an inner thought process that you can hear happening, and then there's an outer narrative, there's interactions with people around you in the crowd. And those two things are very closely interlinked, and they interact and create layers of stress or expectation or pressure. Ultimately, this experience is a 360 film. You can't move around that space. You are anchored in physicality. But we try really to break that barrier of intimacy and bring the world to you, create a sense of closeness with, for example, this actress who plays your mother. A very important part of autism and sensory overload is how you can, it isn't just that one moment, but it's how after many hours, it can take many hours for you to come back to your normal senses and to relax again. We talked quite a bit about what it's like to embody this experience. Would you have a physical body below you if you look down into 360 camera? Would you have something, a body, or is there just nothing? And there are really interesting technical complexities there about why that might break the story you're in and the believability of you being that character, of you being in this world. So we ended up deciding not to have that and going for live action rather than a game engine where you might be able to have those hands or to see that body below you. And that created some really interesting complexities in terms of how we fed that inner dialogue and that outer dialogue, ultimately creating a really complicated and very important audio process where those two streams of the story fit together really well. Everybody's individual audio track is synced up spatially, so you have the ability to sense what people are discussing around you and figure out if some of that is about you. What's really powerful, however, about 360, and that remains the case even after a few years now, where game engine technology is becoming so much more powerful, is that you have the distribution built into the technology, the ability for people everywhere to experience this. And what would be an experience about autism, and in particular one that allows you to learn about this? What would it be if many, many people would not be able to see it? So that was an essential part of that decision-making process. Ultimately, this experience had real impact. I'm extremely proud of it. Even last month, we had an email through in The Guardian of somebody who saw this experience and recognized some of the things that were taking place and decided that they might be autistic. And so they went to their doctor and they went to get diagnosed, and it turned out that they are on the autistic spectrum. Really powerful. I spoke to a school teacher a month ago in Ireland who had used this film in her class because an autistic kid was being bullied by some other kids. And so this film helped her inform everybody, I think these kids were about 12 years old, inform everybody what that experience might be like. And we spent a lot of time, I think this is really powerful and interesting, we spent a lot of time looking at audio as a prototyping tool. So not yet diving into any decisions about the technology. In the early stages, we really were concerned only with the narrative, with the story. And we built up the entire story purely in audio form, not a single visual element yet touched. And then we had an idea of what would be impactful for us, what we felt might really convey the complexity of this issue. And then we started to build a visual world around that. Some really quick quotes from our research at Cambridge, which I think are really powerful in understanding how different the autistic mind can perceive things around us compared to the neurotypical mind. It was really incredible. But what's also important to remember, and we really tried to build this into the story as well, is that autism isn't only a bad experience. It isn't an inferior experience as humans are concerned. So this second quote is a really great example of that. It's actually true for many autistic people who feel that they love their experiences as autistic people. But actually the big challenge often is that neurotypical people don't understand what an autistic experience is like. So it's not about really fixing autism necessarily, it's about fixing everybody else. It's about informing and teaching everybody else. A second project I worked on with The Guardian's Crime Scene, virtual reality game, working with The Guardian and the Google Daydream team. This one I'll go through a little bit quickly, but worked with an incredible team on an experience that is really focused on what a crime scene is actually like, as opposed to the fantasy that you see on television very often. And it's interesting because it's actually a really boring and laborious process. And so how can we turn that into something that is true to the original, in other words, is informative and valuable, and then secondly, actually is fun and entertaining to experience. We spent time at the university there, it's North London University, with the forensic department, and in essence, this is a virtual reality game where you are a rookie crime scene investigator. The experience is volumetrically captured, so this is a real space, this is a real room that you move through and walk in, and you find a dead body, and this is your first day on the job, and you have somebody who is on the phone with you and is helping you to understand what to do and figure out what really happened here. And you start to learn about some of the complexities. I mean, there's something really interesting, I think, about the politics of crime scene investigation. You have a particular budget. You can't take everything with you. You've got to choose your evidence. And the decisions you make as the first person on a crime scene will directly impact what happens in trial many months later. But depending on the victim and depending on the crime, your budget is X. It means you can take 4 items and send them to the lab. And even if there's other really important evidence, you cannot take that. So really, this is about the political complexity of that process. We spent quite a bit of time on the UI, on how you turn some of those physical actions, like taking fibers off of a body, into an interface, into an enjoyable, fun thing that you can play with, but also, again, meaningful. And then the experience is volumetrically captured using LiDAR scanners. So it's a real location and real, well, not real blood, but fake blood, but a real space with a real actor who plays our dead person. He lay there for about 4 hours, actually, just while the capturing process was happening. And then the third Guardian project is Sea Prayer, a really important and powerful piece, I think. I'm very excited and proud to have been a part of it, and with a message that has been covered and touched on by many others in various ways. But this covers a very specific issue that remains an issue on an almost weekly basis, if not daily basis right now. And that's the crossing from any part of Africa or the Middle East over the Mediterranean into Europe. It's a story really not about the politics about that journey, but a simple message of a father's goodbye, a father writing a letter to his son, knowing that they will separate on the beach and perhaps not see each other again. And so it isn't about politics, but about the emotional pressure of that moment. And it is a tribute to Alan Kurdi, who many years ago, unfortunately, died on the beach in Greece. That was the inspiration point for this team to come together, but in particular, this team to come together on top of the writing of Khaled Hosseini, who wrote that letter. He wrote a hypothetical letter of goodbye to his son. And that was the basis for us to make this experience. We built this experience on really his words. If you read that letter, this is obviously a little tiny excerpt of the introduction. We've literally visualized those words, the memories that he has using tilt brush. So you can see a few images here of us in the early stages looking at what this might look like. But this is a fully tilt brush experience. You can look around it, move around it, it's static, but it's being drawn on as you watch. And then finally, you end up on the beach with the father and the son saying goodbye, and him putting a letter in the clothing of the son to be remembered. Here you can see a few scenes of me looking around in Tilbrush. Now, the final experience is a 360 film we generated from this with audio and a voice that is reading the letter to his son. It's interesting because really you use, in this virtual and augmented or in the XR space, you often end up using imperfect tools to try to make an important message. Tilbrush isn't a tool with a lot of flexibility. It was obvious for us to use it because it was an incredibly easy way for us to create this visual space and to iterate and change our mind about it. But ultimately, Tilbrush doesn't export layers or depth, and we had to recreate that. And then secondly, it doesn't import sound. So again, we had to recreate it in a different way. On the other hand, Tilbrush is a tool anybody can use. We ended up pushing it very far, but it is a very accessible tool. And that makes it powerful again, I think. There are other artists. Sutu is worth looking up if you have time and are curious about how Tilbrush is being used for powerful journalism. Sutu is a great person to look up. It really opens up a tool to everybody to try to figure out their own version of what a story could be. You don't have to necessarily... He in particular deals with issues such as post-traumatic stress syndrome for people who've come back from the war. Now, journalism generally would assume you're going into a war zone, but it is not always necessary. An artist can express a message using Tilbrush or any number of other tools. A few quick projects that are more fictional-based. Sayat is a project I worked on, which is a 4D haptic virtual reality film. It's pure commercial. It's a car commercial in essence. But it is interesting, I think, to inhabit a whole new version of the real world. And filming that was a lot of fun. I have a quick clip here which give you a sense of what that journey was like. It's really a project that challenges the difference between innovation and experience. So let me see if the video will play. So, it's pure spectacle, but it is interesting for me, specifically in terms of team building, that difference between innovation and experience. A mixture of a classic commercials filming crew and a new type of innovation-based team that builds cameras and that looks at visual post-production to erase all those cameras, like the guy on the skateboard needed to be fully painted out of that experience in order to make a journey, a virtual version of this car chase in Barcelona that felt like you weren't being distracted by the technology, but you were in this space. Beyond that, of course, it is a spectacle. It is interesting also in terms of team building. What I observed in particular on projects similar to SEA is insecurity in a team is a real creativity killer. So you have to try, I think, on projects like that to really think about, okay, insecurity in this process is an acceptable part of the journey. It is okay not to know how exactly to do this. And then finally, the creative flow that you create after that decision means that everybody can see past the chaos. The chaos being, this shot doesn't work, how do we fix it? We have 1 hour, let's find a way. Sensar is beginning to get closer to this idea of choosing your own reality. It's a project built on the platform Sensar, so social VR. In other words, a space you inhabit with many others who are in different parts of the world, and all together you're in this visual sort of room. Like that. You're all just hanging out. Everybody is at home with a headset. And working in that tool, I've done quite a few of the visual spaces. And if you look at the guy here on the right with the headphones, Dragster is somebody who leads the weekly crawl through different spaces in Sensar with a whole group, 30, 40 people at the same time. In essence, doing a walking tour of 4 or 5 spaces every single Tuesday. And those are people who become friends and get to know each other really well over time. So building in that space and trying to think about how we both are in a different location as well as in the same, and how we co-inhabit the same space was really fascinating. I created a number of spaces. This is one of them, a sort of floating island of old temple inspired by monkeys. And a beautiful, beautiful lighting engine, really, really fun to play with. I spent quite a bit of time in Sensar. It's an interesting space to spend time in. You bump into people. The first time I bumped into a stranger in Sensar was really freaky. I was on an old pirate ship, and it was in the early days of the platform. And I was looking around this space that was half built, and suddenly another person was there, looking at me, and I couldn't really tell if it was part of the scenery or not. And then that person moved towards me and started to walk in my direction. And I was sitting on a chair, obviously, and it really freaked me out. But slowly you begin to get used to the fact that there are people everywhere just popping up, flying around, and doing things that they love how to do. And there are some key things about Sensar that are really powerful. The story knows you're there. It understands your voice. Eye tracking becomes possible within that space. And so there are layers of communication that take you out of the physical limits of the world that we live in. And you can become anything. This is an avatar, just in the same way as that is an avatar. And meeting up in that virtual space in any avatar kind of blurs the line between what you understand as a human physical form. Camp Century is one project that is built on the same exact platform, but with a very different mission. It isn't crazy sci-fi or weird, funny meetings. It's actually rebuilding a historical place that was built in northern Greenland in around the 1955 or so, and which 10 years later was lost to the ice. So it disappeared, no longer exists. Camp Century is in production now. We've built this virtual version of Sensar, of Camp Century that you can visit together. And I got a couple of really quick images of that. I won't go too far, but it's essentially about visiting a place that no longer exists. You can see some quick images of what it's like to walk around that space. And then Drift is another project that I'm working on right now. Drift is really about a connection with somebody who's living 25 years from now. Drift is an augmented reality project. You'll meet somebody who isn't here today, but is going to live in 25 years. And therefore, initially through the contact of these mysterious objects that you find in your world today now, but finally through a link to her living in the future, you start learning about the longer-term impact of what climate change is going to become. It's already a dramatic, even this week with the heat wave, a dramatic impact. But what about climate change in 25 years? What are the longer-term trends? So you meet, ultimately, Faye, who, this is a very early prototype, but she is somebody who speaks to you from the future and explains to you what that's like. Again, just a sneak preview. So very briefly about what all of that work, some of which is just happening now, but most of which is in the past for me, means for the future, and this idea of choosing your own reality. So a persistent depth layer in the real world, city-scale projects become possible. And so taking some of the virtual reality experiences or projects like Drift and spreading them out across the world becomes possible. The idea that all these layers of information, every wall, every floor, this should play. Sometimes the video won't initially play. Every layer, every surface, the floor, the walls, the tables, the chairs, are a pixel grid of information that you could or could not activate. It's up to you. And when you layer what is now on your phone into a headset, into a pair of glasses, just these early long-term prototypes of future glasses, future lenses, you start to be able to see the world as anything. Whether you really don't, this is so no border between the real and the virtual. Whether you live inside of Sansar, this is a business meeting happening in Sansar where everybody has the same avatar. Or this is some people messing around in VR chat. You become completely accustomed very quickly to the fact that your physical human form is no longer important to you. This is a part of that journey of letting go of that idea of reality. The future and the past blend. Camp Century is one part of that. This is a much more simple Snapchat filter example of that, of a photograph in a place that has existed for many, many decades and in fact several centuries. And seeing those two blend is really fascinating, I think. Your real world is fully editable and customizable. This plays out in many different forms, but the idea of what we think of as real now is kind of over. Somebody might have this layer on top, and it might not be visible to you, but it might be visible to them. And it means that nobody is really looking at the same thing anymore. As of really kind of about now, as of about these 5 or 10 years that we are in the middle of, reality all around us is going to be different for all of us. And the deepfake discussion is only really one of the many examples of that.
Expected Amy to win.
But more interestingly, I think this is something I grabbed off of Twitter, of a very first experiment in automatically erasing cars. It doesn't work, but you can imagine it working in the 3rd or the 4th or the 5th version, where a machine is editing and changing the world based on either something you've decided or maybe something you didn't decide. It could be cars, it might be homeless people. It's up to you, or it's up to a machine. Everything around you becomes a tool as well. So just a simple New York City metro ticket becomes an animation or a map. And it makes you the user interface, your movements and your positioning. This is really awesome, I think, as an example of this is a few years ago now, powerful piece of augmented reality, of physically moving and therefore changing what you're looking at. The proximity changes the photograph and makes this person grow from young to old. Machine learning is a massive part of this transformation of how our reality is changing and what choices we can make within that reality. So, stupid example, being able to tap on a shoe and then bringing up the Amazon page and see what that shoe is. That's a really silly example, but it has really powerful implications. Another example is the Snapchat gender swap filter, which came out a month ago or so, allowing you to become a believable woman or believable man based on your appearance in real time. And that makes many versions of you. In other words, okay, that's a version of you that is a gender swap, but visually you can become different too. You can look at digital makeup that becomes a part of your permanent identity, or that hides part of your identity. Slowly the real merges with the virtual. I mean, I've made quite a few really silly and really kind of random experiences in Snapchat. But this is really powerful because something that seemed like just an experiment where I had this digital arm, this is based on a game called Death Stranding. So you have this digital arm that looks over your shoulder just like the character in the game. Ended up traveling online, and this is a guy that goes to cosplay events. He dresses up as virtual characters in real life, and that lens that I made, that 3D arm I made, became a part of his costume. He's a real costume mixed with a virtual layer. But equally, you don't have to go into crazy sci-fi, and this is just a simple volumetric test. Real person that exists somewhere else in a different dimension of scale or time or space. And it can also, these examples are mostly quite fun, but it could also lead to meaningful change. I just have a couple of examples of that. I'm almost done. This is a project by the team in USC in Los Angeles.
Hi, my name is Jennifer. I'm going to show you how homeless people live here in Echo Park. And we're going to look around at my tent today. So welcome.
So it allows you
Hi, my name is Jennifer.
Simply to figure out how someone else's life might be. And this is an example by a friend of mine, Yusuf, who used Snapchat lenses to allow women in India who had suffered sexual abuse to hide their identity and to know that they weren't being recorded and would maybe later be identified, which allowed them to open up more about what they'd experienced. A couple of quick notes. So virtual and augmented and mixed reality expand our human abilities. I think it's really powerful. And at the same time, we need to ask ourselves how we're going to use that responsibly as storytellers. It's something I'm thinking about and asking myself and the people around me all the time. What does it really mean? And also, how do the tools that we use become more accessible to all? And this is actually happening, I do think, like Unity and Unreal are already free software tools, and there are many others out there, but we need accessibility so we can create a wider diversity and a better representation of all voices in this space. And this really is the key. I think I am already aware constantly of the interplay between the real me and the virtual me and how they sometimes connect, but other times have different lives and do different things. And so you don't really drop into the virtual anymore. It's there all the time. And it's living in parallel. Finally, I think it's really important to be critical in all of this and ask, what does that mean? And is that good or bad? And in every single detail. You can't not have doubts about these technologies for them to become useful to us rather than for them to become misleading. I think about these things and question these things and write about these things and build some of the knowledge of the past into the work I do in the future at the R&D studio I mentioned. So please do connect. I'd love to hear more from you guys, and thank you very much.